The year was 1891. Somewhere in the quiet, forgotten corners of Utah Territory, a small church stood at the edge of a dusty road. Its stone walls had been standing for decades, absorbing the silence of every prayer ever whispered within them. The wooden pews were worn smooth, the candles flickered gently in the still air, and the only sound was the soft creak of the building itself, breathing, as old buildings sometimes do. It was early morning, no congregation, no service, just the sacred emptiness that fills a church before the world wakes up. Then the door opened. A man stepped inside. His boots were heavy with mud. His coat was dusty from days of hard riding. His eyes, sharp, careful, scanning every corner, were the eyes of someone who had learned long ago that safety was never guaranteed. He moved quietly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he is not sure who might be watching. He chose a bench near the back, sat down, removed his hat, and lowered his head. At that same moment, an old priest on the other side of the church looked up from his work. He saw the man. He recognized him. And he said nothing, not a single word, not to the man, not to anyone outside, not ever. That moment of silence, that single deliberate choice, is what this story is about. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you have not subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you stories like this, hidden, forgotten, and powerful, every single week. To truly understand what happened inside that church, you first need to understand the man who walked into it. The world knew him as Butch Cassidy, but that was not the name his mother gave him. He was born Robert Leroy Parker on April 13, 1866, in Beaver, Utah, deep inside what was then a tight-knit Mormon community. His father, Maximilian Parker, and his mother, Ann Gillies, were devout, hard-working people. They raised their children with discipline, faith, and a strong sense of right and wrong. By all accounts, Robert's early childhood was not wild or reckless. It was simple, modest, and rooted in the values of the church. But poverty has a way of pulling people in directions their parents never intended. The Parker family struggled financially. As a young teenager, Robert began working on local ranches to help support his family. It was honest work, but it was also the work that introduced him to a man who would change the entire course of his life. That man's name was Mike Cassidy, a skilled horseman, a smooth talker, and a part-time outlaw. Mike took a liking to young Robert. He taught him how to ride, how to shoot, and perhaps most dangerously, how to look at the world as a place where the rules were made by those in power, and breaking those rules was not always wrong. Robert idolized him. He even took his mentor's last name as his own. As for Butch, that nickname came later, from a brief period when Robert worked in a butcher shop in Rock Springs, Wyoming. And so, Butch Cassidy was born. Through the late 1880s, Cassidy built a reputation that spread across Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. He became the leader of the Wild Bunch, also known as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, one of the most organized and successful outlaw gangs in American history. Among its members was the famous Sundance Kid, whose real name was Harry Longabout. Together, they robbed banks. They robbed trains. They moved fast, planned carefully, and disappeared into the rugged wilderness of the American West before law enforcement could catch up. What made Cassidy stand apart from other outlaws of his era was a peculiar kind of restraint. He preferred not to use violence when it could be avoided. There are remarkably few confirmed accounts of Cassidy personally killing anyone. He was smart, charming, and at times almost gentlemanly, qualities that made ordinary people root for him even as the law hunted him. But none of that changed the fact that he was a wanted man, and in 1891, he was very much on the run. To understand why Cassidy ended up in that church, you have to understand what 1891 looked like in the American West. The era of the Wild West was not quite over yet, but it was beginning to crack at the edges. Railroads were spreading across the country. connecting once isolated towns to the rest of America. Telegraph lines were going up. Newspapers were printing wanted posters that traveled faster than any horse. The world was getting smaller, and for outlaws, that was a very dangerous thing. Utah Territory in 1891 was still 5 years away from becoming a state. It existed in a legal gray zone. Federal authority was present, but thin. Local sheriffs and U.S. Marshals were the primary law enforcement, and their ability to coordinate across large distances was limited. Outlaws knew the terrain better than lawmen did, and they exploited that advantage constantly. Cassidy, during this period, was moving frequently between Wyoming and Utah. Historians believe that sometime around 1891, he was involved in a series of livestock thefts in the region, a crime that may seem minor compared to bank robbery, but one that was taken extremely seriously in the ranching communities of the West. Cattle and horse theft was a hanging offense in many places. With a posse possibly on his trail, Cassidy needed to move carefully. He could not risk the main roads. He could not walk into a saloon or a hotel without risking recognition. He needed somewhere to stop, somewhere to breathe, somewhere that, by its very nature, might offer him a moment of safety. And so, somewhere along a dusty road in rural Utah, he saw the stone walls of a small church. He made a decision. He went inside. The church was small, even by the modest standards of frontier Utah. Stone walls, thick enough to hold out the cold of winter and the heat of summer. Wooden benches arranged in 2 neat rows, leading toward a simple altar at the front. A few candles burned near the altar, not for any scheduled service, but because they were always kept burning. A faded wooden cross hung on the wall behind it. It was the kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time. Cassidy entered quietly. He was not swaggering or dramatic in the way that dime novels of the era often described outlaws. He was a practical man, and right now, practical meant invisible. He stepped inside, let the heavy door close softly behind him, and paused for a moment to let his eyes adjust to the dim interior. Then he moved to a bench near the back, close to the door, away from the windows. Old habit. Always sit where you can see the entrance. Always know your way out. He sat down. He set his hat on the bench beside him. He folded his hands. Whether he prayed, no one knows for certain. But in that moment, something in the posture of the man suggested that the hard shell had cracked slightly. The tightness in the jaw, the heaviness in the shoulders. A man who had been holding himself together through willpower alone. Finally, for just a moment, letting go. On the other side of the church, near the altar, an old priest was going about his morning routine, trimming candle wicks, straightening hymnals, moving slowly unhurried, the way men move when they have made their peace with time. And then he looked up. The 2 men saw each other. A long moment passed between them, the kind of moment that seems to stretch beyond its actual seconds. The priest looked at the man in the back pew. Something moved behind the old man's eyes. Recognition. Certainty. He knew exactly who was sitting in his church. And then, quietly, without any visible reaction, he looked back down and continued his work. This is the part of the story that stays with you. The priest knew. He was not confused, not uncertain. He had seen enough of Cassidy's description, in newspapers, on wanted posters, through the conversations of his community, to know with confidence who the man in the back pew was. And he chose silence. Why? The first reason may lie in one of the oldest traditions of the Christian church, the concept of sanctuary. For centuries, stretching back to medieval Europe, a church was considered a place of refuge. Anyone who entered the house of God seeking shelter was, by sacred tradition, protected within its walls. This was not merely a symbolic gesture. In many European countries, it had been legally recognized. Law enforcement was not permitted to forcibly remove someone from a church without violating the sanctity of the space. While this tradition had not been formally enshrined in American law, the spiritual principle remained deeply embedded in the consciousness of devout clergy. The old priest, in that moment, may have seen himself not as a citizen with a civic duty to report a criminal, but as a servant of God, whose first obligation was to the man in need standing before him. The second reason is simply human. Cassidy, at that moment, was not a threat. He was not waving a weapon. He was not demanding anything. He was a tired man who had come to a quiet place and sat down. The priest would have seen that immediately, and in the face of a tired, hurting human being, the instinct to call for law enforcement can feel deeply wrong, regardless of what that person may have done in the past. There is also a third possibility, one rooted in the specific geography and community of Utah. Cassidy had grown up in this world. He came from a Mormon family in this very territory. It is entirely possible that the old priest, whether Mormon, Catholic, or of another denomination, had some connection to the Parker family, that he had watched Robert Leroy Parker grow up, or had known his parents, or had heard the story of how a good boy from a good family had ended up on the wrong side of everything. To see that boy now grown and haunted, sitting in the back of your church, that changes things. According to several historical accounts, the priest eventually approached Cassidy, not to question him, not to warn him. He simply set a plate of bread and a cup of water on the bench beside him, and reportedly said something along the lines of, "Rest here. No one will trouble you." Cassidy said very little. Perhaps he nodded. Perhaps he said thank you. And then, after a time, he left. The priest never told anyone what had happened. Not that day. Not in the years that followed. Did that morning in the church change Butch Cassidy? It is impossible to say with absolute certainty. History rarely gives us clean answers to questions about the inner lives of men. But there are details, patterns, and accounts from those who knew Cassidy that suggest that moment, or moments like it, left a mark on him. Throughout his career, even at the height of his outlaw years, Cassidy maintained a peculiar code. He was not cruel. He did not terrorize ordinary people. There are accounts of him being genuinely kind to strangers, going out of his way to help someone in need, even while living outside the law. People who encountered him in his outlaw days often described a man who seemed, in some fundamental way, uncomfortable with what he had become. The tension between his Mormon upbringing and his chosen life never fully resolved itself. He had been raised in a community that valued community, honesty, and the brotherhood of man, and yet he had spent his adult years taking from others, living in hiding, trusting almost no one. That contradiction does not disappear just because a man has committed himself to a certain path. Cassidy spoke, on more than one occasion, about wanting to go straight, to find some plot of land somewhere, in South America, in the Western Territories, somewhere far from wanted posters and posses, and simply live. Honestly, quietly, he never fully achieved that dream, but the fact that he kept returning to it suggests that the man who walked into that church in 1891 was not entirely lost. The church did not save him, but it reminded him, at least for one morning, that he was still a human being, and that someone somewhere was willing to see him that way. The old priest never sought recognition for what he did. He lived out his days in the same quiet routine, his church, his candles, his morning prayers. The community around him knew him as a gentle, steady presence, a man of few words and deep conviction. He never told anyone about the morning a famous outlaw sat in his back pew. If he kept a journal, none of it has surfaced. If he confided in a fellow clergyman, they kept the secret as well. It was only years later, through indirect local accounts, through the oral traditions of small Utah communities, through fragments pieced together by historians, that the story began to emerge. And even then it came in pieces, a mention here, a reference there. Nothing official, nothing confirmed by a signed document or a dated letter. But the story persisted, because stories like this, stories of quiet mercy, of a choice made in a moment when no one was watching, have a way of surviving, not because they were written down, but because they were felt by the people who heard them, by the communities that passed them on. The priest died, most likely, without ever knowing that his silence would one day be considered one of the most quietly remarkable acts in the story of Butch Cassidy. He was not a hero in the traditional sense. He carried no weapon. He stopped no crime. He changed no law. But he looked at a wanted man and chose to see a person. That is its own kind of courage. Whatever peace that church offered Cassidy that morning, it did not slow him down for long. Through the 1890s, he and the Wild Bunch continued their operations, growing bolder, more sophisticated, more wanted. The Great Northern Train robbery of 1901 was among their most famous jobs. By that point, the Pinkerton Detective Agency had made Cassidy and the Sundance Kid their top priority. The net was closing. Facing the reality that America was no longer big enough to hide in, Cassidy and Sundance made a dramatic decision. They left. In 1901, the two men, along with Sundance's companion, Etta Place, sailed to South America. They settled in Patagonia, Argentina, where they attempted, for a time, to live as legitimate ranchers under assumed names. For a few years, it seemed to work, but old habits, old skills, and old desperation eventually pulled them back. By 1905, they were robbing banks in Bolivia and Argentina. The law in South America was now also after them. And then, November 1908, in the Bolivian town of San Vicente, two foreign bandits robbed a mining company payroll. Bolivian soldiers surrounded them. A fierce confrontation followed. When it was over, two men were found dead. The official Bolivian report identified them as the two American outlaws. The world was told Butch Cassidy was dead. But here is where the mystery begins. The bodies were never positively identified by anyone who had known Cassidy personally. No photographs, no fingerprints, no formal confirmation from American authorities. And in the years that followed, multiple people, including most notably Cassidy's own sister, Lula Parker Bettinson, claimed that Butch had in fact returned to the United States, that he had lived quietly under a different name somewhere in the American West for years after the supposed Bolivian shootout. Lula Parker Bettinson wrote a book, Butch Cassidy, My Brother, published in 1975, in which she maintained that her brother had visited the family after 1908. She described a dinner, a conversation, a man who was older, quieter, but alive. Was she telling the truth? Was she protecting a memory? Was she repeating a story the family had constructed to make peace with a painful history? No one knows for certain. What we do know is this. The man who walked into a Utah church in 1891, tired and hunted, carrying the weight of the life he had chosen, that man lived a story far more complicated than any wanted poster could capture. And somewhere in that complexity, that morning in the church still sits quietly, a moment of stillness in a life that rarely stood still. So what do we take from all of this? On the surface, this is a story about an outlaw and a priest, about a famous fugitive and an old man who chose not to turn him in, about a moment in 1891 that no one witnessed and almost no one recorded. But underneath that, there is something far more universal. We live in a world that loves to categorize people, good and bad, guilty and innocent, worthy and unworthy. And once a person has been placed into one of those categories, especially the wrong ones, we rarely stop to ask whether the category fits the whole person or just one chapter of their story. The old priest, in that quiet moment, refused to reduce the man in front of him to a label on a wanted poster. He looked at a human being. He responded with bread, water, and silence. That choice, simple, private, unrecorded, may have been the most profound thing anyone ever did for Butch Cassidy. Silence is not always cowardice. Sometimes silence is the most deliberate act of mercy a person can offer. And perhaps that is the question we should all sit with. If you had been that priest, what would you have done? Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. If this story moved you or made you think, please give it a like. It helps more people find stories like this one. And if you are new here, subscribe right now. Every week, we bring you the hidden chapters of history, the moments that did not make it into textbooks, but shaped the world anyway. In our next video, we are going into another story that history almost forgot, one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, the most important moments in history are often the ones that happened in silence.